Bonjour les amis, bienvenue à Paris, 13th arrondissement, really special neighborhood known as la Butte aux Cailles, Quails Hill. So early in the morning everything is still closed, and that's what I love doing the best in Paris. Sleepy neighborhood, a great breakfast, continental breakfast, need to have a croissant of course, and a café allongé. And today I'm going to show you this great neighborhood and tell you more about its history. So I hope you're ready. Here we are along one of the well-known streets here, la rue des 5 Diamants, the street of the 5 diamonds. And one thing right away we should point out is that if you come to the 13th arrondissement today, and especially the Butte aux Cailles, you will see quite a lot of street art. So if you're not into street art, I recommend you step away from the 13th arrondissement. I just want to pay a tribute here to one of the leading street artists in this neighborhood for several decades. Her name was Mystic. You can see her signature there on the right hand side, and she was as well known for her representations here. The technique is known as pochoir in French. A lot of female characters, as she was for her puns. And this is probably a more recent one she's done. On the right hand side it says port du cerveau obligatoire. This is in reference of course to the mandatory face masks that we've had to wear for the last couple of years, and here she says it's mandatory to have a brain. Mystic, unfortunately, after working in this neighborhood and in other neighborhoods for decades, there's another one by her across the street, passed away in May this year of cancer, and she is fondly remembered here. In fact, there's been talk in Paris to rename a square after her in tribute. She inspired a lot of younger street artists, and a lot of people think it's well deserved. So it's pretty obvious from what I'm showing you, we are on a hill. Here's another artist here along the Rue Jonas. So it's pretty obvious we are on a hill, and indeed, we don't have that many hills in Paris, not anymore, but la Butte aux Cailles, Quails Hill, is one of them. It's not very high, I mean 63 meters or so, and that's what, 200 feet? Not very high, but you do feel, especially here in this section, which is part of the highest section, you do feel this here. I'm going to highlight today on this stroll some of the features of the neighborhood, but also what helps understand the history of this neighborhood. And the reason why everything is closed is because I am doing this at 8:30 in the morning on a Saturday. This is quite the lively neighborhood in the evenings, with bars and restaurants, especially in this section. We will see that a little later. But in the morning on a Saturday, especially in August, things are pretty quiet, and I like it this way. So we are walking along the Rue des 5 Diamants, and I'm very quickly going to make a right, going to turn right. You can see more street art. Some people would argue graffiti. So that's a debate I'm not going to join. I'll let you make up your own mind. Oh, here's someone I know. I've talked about him in an episode of Apéro with Vero on my YouTube channel. His name was Coluche, C-O-L-U-C-H-E, and he was a comedian, a stand-up comic, as well as a humanitarian, and he passed away in the 80s. He's still fondly remembered. You can see the variety in the street art. Interestingly, as far as architecture goes, we can already see there aren't that many high buildings along the street, and there's a reason for that. Below our feet are quarries, miles and miles and miles of quarries. That's the case in several sections of Paris. You've heard of the catacombs in the 14th arrondissement. It's not the only one. I'm going to make a right here in this lovely passage, the passage Barreau. Cobblestones, houses. You can tell it's like traveling back in time already. So I'm going to watch my step as we pass this car. Bonjour madame. C'est calme ce matin, c'est agréable.
Oui.
Très calme. People are super friendly here, and if they see you filming or taking photos, they will step up and they will come and talk to you and ask you if you need information about the neighborhood. Those are people who've been here for a while, and you can tell they're really proud about the Butte aux Cailles and this entire neighborhood. But then again, that applies to other Parisians as well in other neighborhoods, but I've felt it here in La Butte aux Cailles since I've been here, since I've arrived here. So a lovely passage. We can only imagine what pretty gardens hide behind those walls. And I just wanted you to take a peek at that before we go on to our next stop. And here we are at the corner of the Rue Barreau and the Rue Alphand. This is a well-known corner for street art. I've seen many interesting many interesting creations, I should say, here over the years. This one is quite colorful. So it's like the present mixes with the past. Because as soon as you turn your head, you see streets like these, and definitely a village feel here. I am standing outside a development known as La Petite Alsace, Small Alsace. It's a gated community of sorts, so you can only get in if someone will let you in. It's too early in the morning to do that now, but not to worry, I'm going to show you a few special places. This is the Villa d'Avielle across the street. La Petite Alsace, we just saw, was created in 1913. La Villa d'Avielle is a little bit based on the same principle. A lot of work was done in this neighborhood from the second half of the 19th century all the way to World War I to try and tame and clean a river that ran through the 13th arrondissement, what we know today as the 13th arrondissement, and the 5th arrondissement as well, and ended in the Seine, but in the Seine River. But over the years, there were tanneries, dyeing shops lined up along that river. The river was extremely polluted and unsanitary, as you can imagine. So during a time period known as the Second Empire in Paris, the second half of the 19th century, a lot of effort, time and resources were spent trying to do something with that river to make the entire section it crossed more livable, if you will. They used the rubble from the metro construction site at the time, and eventually the entire river, La Bievre, was covered. And today it still runs. Its course has been altered. It doesn't go inside into the Seine anymore. It's connected to the sewer system, but it runs outside Paris as well, except it's underground. From the day they were able to do this, this area, in terms of construction, developed greatly. But because of the quarries that were underground, they could not really build very high buildings. Now these little houses that kind of look a little different, each of them, all come with a small garden. In the early 20th century, at about the time the Bievre was finally tamed, there was a belief among the elites in society that workers, especially blue-collar workers, needed to lead healthier lifestyles. And so there was an attempt to give them better housing, better living conditions. This street is an example of what was done at the time by private investment funds to let those workers become property owners. So the way this would work is a private investment company would buy the land and build those houses, and then they would resell them to workers with very low interest rates, and the workers could pay them back in about 20 years. And this was the first time that workers were able to live like this. So today on this stroll we're going to see different types of constructions that were done in the first part of the 20th century by companies, by investment funds, for workers, not just blue-collar workers, because after a while here in La Butte aux Cailles, there were different social classes mixing. You also had white-collar workers here. But you can see today, of course, these are coveted. This is the perfect blend of the countryside and the city, and you are in Paris. So imagine what it's like to be able to live in a home today. Look at the ivy covering up this facade and stairs. Imagine what it's like today to be able to live in a place like this, to have access to a garden, especially if you went through the lockdowns, the long lockdowns. We had 3 in 2020 and 2021. So this is part of Paris' social history and what was done at the time to help workers. And a lot of business owners could be seen in a way as philanthropists in the way they helped their workers. Of course, there was a paternalistic approach as well, so there's a debate about that. But the result are these constructions we will see on this stroll today. And again, this one is called La Villa d'Aviel. So villa here doesn't mean a house. Villa is I was going to say a compound, because very often a villa is behind gates, very similar to American gated communities, but this one, more humble probably, less ambitious because it was for blue-collar workers, is open. And across from us is the one I showed you earlier, La Petite Alsace, the little Alsace, which is somewhat different in style. The buildings are I think they call this style Anglo-Norman, and it was a priest actually that helped create it, and inside through that gate here is a courtyard which is lined with houses, and in 1913 they inaugurated it. They could house about 300 people, families. And here we are walking along the Rue Michel, and we have a peek at the local church, which is called Sainte Anne of La Butte aux Cailles. And this church is quite interesting inside, and it was added in the second half of the 19th century. For a long time, La Butte aux Cailles, this entire neighborhood, was in fact part of a village that stood outside Paris. It was known as Gentilly. And as you probably remember, I've told you the story of many of these former villages around Paris. Gentilly was eventually, or parts of Gentilly were eventually incorporated into the city of Paris by Napoleon III after 1860. And they became, all of these neighborhoods, actual arrondissements. This is when Paris went from 12 to 20 arrondissements. We are currently in the 13th. So a lot of development was done at the time in some of these neighborhoods, but here in La Butte aux Cailles, they were quite limited as to what they could do in terms of streets and buildings because of the quarries, the tunnels below our feet. So a lot of the houses were quite low at first. And even today, you see signs on the walls that tell you that cars or trucks are limited to a certain weight if they want to go through a street. So there's still a risk. But it is a village-like neighborhood, so it has its own church. Bienvenue to la place Paul Verlaine, one of the major areas in La Butte aux Cailles, a square where a lot of locals meet. We have a few landmarks on the square. I'm going to point out a couple. What you see here with the pigeons are pétanque courts. It's not unusual to see people playing pétanque here. Another highlight of this neighborhood is a famous fountain. A famous fountain that comes with a great story. During the Second Empire, as I mentioned, a lot of work was done to this neighborhood at that point. Napoleon III authorized digging to bring some water to locals. A lot of homes didn't have water at that time. And so they went digging and digging. Work took a lot of time because it was interrupted by an uprising in the 1870s. But eventually in 1904, the water that comes from way below ground spurted out. And at that time, the water was warm, 28 Celsius, about 80 something Fahrenheit. And so they thought, because it was the start of the 20th century, that they could use it for locals as well as to feed a swimming pool that was built a little later on in the 1920s, right there, that red brick building I'll show you in a second. So this fountain was special because it was the water was supplied by an artesian well. Like I said, that was really, really deep. So a fun thing to do is to come here with a bottle of water and to drink that water, to fill your bottles. This gentleman here, right around the corner, is doing exactly that. And you'll see a lot of locals come here with those little shopping carts, trolleys, and they'll fill a lot of bottles. And they claim this water is the best water they've ever tasted, better than the water provided by the city of Paris. So something to do when you come here. Use that fountain, play pétanque maybe, relax on one of the benches. That's part of Parisian life. The street is a little busy, quite a bit of traffic even on a Saturday morning. And now we head to the swimming pool I just mentioned. You know, Paris, the city of Paris, runs about 40 public pools like this one. But this one was one of the original ones, maybe the third of the fourth to be inaugurated. In 1924, the brick facade, the bricks come from outside Paris in the Marne region. It's a very interesting swimming pool because it was the first one. You see the sign here says Ville de Paris, établissement balnéaire, établissement balnéaire. This is a very fancy name for a swimming pool. That's usually what you use to refer to a spa. De la Butte aux Cailles. Well, this was the first swimming pool where hygiene became a big deal, where swimming was separated very clearly from hygiene, because you also have some baths, some public baths. In fact, this left side here are public baths that are still in operation today. So people from anyone really can come here for free and take a shower, nice, hot, clean water, take a shower for free. You still have several of these around Paris. But then they created the swimming pool, which at first got its water from the artesian well we mentioned at the fountain. Today the water doesn't come from the well anymore because the city of Paris wants to save the water from the fountain for Parisians in case disaster strikes. So the water is supplied by the city of Paris. But because it was built in 1924, the decor is very interesting. It was built entirely out of concrete, out of reinforced concrete, which was quite new at the time in the early 20th century. And inside the main room where the big swimming pool is, Olympic-sized swimming pool is, the ceiling is quite interesting. It looks like a little bit like you're in a church. With concrete, they were able to create a ceiling that's quite striking with vaults. And the reason is originally they were going to do a church here, but it turned into the swimming pool. Now, something really interesting happened, because when I was here yesterday, I stepped in. I'd never been inside, and I said, I really would like to see the swimming pool, especially the outdoor section, because there is an outdoor section. And the people couldn't have been nicer. A nice lady called Catherine, who's worked here for 17 years, took me in, gave me an entire tour, told me the entire story of the swimming pool, really proud of telling me, of showing me around. I also met a very friendly maître nageur, lifeguard, who's also a fireman named Louis, and I was there for 45 minutes, listening to their stories about the pool and why it's such a big deal in Paris. So if you like swimming pools and if you'd like to swim, I definitely encourage you to come here to the swimming pool in La Butte aux Cailles. The entrance fee is only €3.50. And how many swimming pools with an Art Nouveau facade have you been into? This would be a very special thing to do in Paris off the beaten tourist path. We have left the top of the hill and the Butte aux Cailles neighborhood. We are walking downhill now and entering a neighborhood that is probably more known as Le Moulin des Prés, as mentioned here on this boulangerie, and on the plaque here, Rue du Moulin des Prés. I have a few more things to show you, special places that were developed in the 20th century. Once the Bievre River had been tamed and buried. And it's interesting to see how a neighborhood evolves. All of Paris continues to evolve, but the old buildings, the stones, still tell us about the past. Here is a very peaceful place. It's called the Square des Peupliers, Voie Privée. It's a private area, so I'll be very quiet to show you the entire area. Peuplier, that's a poplar tree, a very elegant, tall, thin poplar tree. There used to be poplars lining up the Bievre River as it ran freely through the 13th and the 5th arrondissement, before they were even called the 13th and the 5th arrondissement. That's why this name came about. Here we have another example of a complex, a development that was erected. In 1926, so this is after World War I, but again, to give workers an opportunity to access home ownership. Of course, today, lucky fews live here. Each house has a garden, because in the early 20th century, the hygienist theories claimed that a garden was essential to lead a healthy life, even in the city. Cobblestones, quite uneven, you have to watch your step here. And if you come here, we have to be very respectful of residents, because it is a private part of town. That's why I came early in the day. This is Darling. There's a little table and 2 chairs and a sign that says garden, where you have a few pots, because not all of them have big gardens unless they have more space in the back, which we can't see here. The glass awning I love so much. They're called marquises, M-A-R-Q-U-I-S-E. I think they add a touch of elegance to the home entrance, but just like a porte cochere, they protect you from the elements as well when you come home if it's raining. Here's a great example here. Very French entrance with your shutters, and you have your geraniums. Have to have geraniums in the summer. So it's a bit of a loop, really. You can't go anywhere from here. You just have to go around in a loop. And the Square des Peupliers is quite famous. It's been featured a lot on social media. So you'll see people here a lot more than you used to years ago. Love the lights, don't you? Now keep in mind, these lights, which are electric now, used to be powered by gas. His name was l'allumeur de réverbère. Réverbère is the name of the light, of the lamp. L'allumeur from allumer, to turn on, to light. He would come in the morning to turn them on, and he would come at night to turn them off. There's a beautiful facade ahead of us with wisteria climbing. I think the best time to come here would probably be spring, if you want to smell the lilacs and see the wisterias in action too. This one has climbed all the way to the top of the building. All right. So of course the Bievre flowed nearby. So we're headed now to this square ahead of us, which is called La Place de l'Abbé Georges Enoch, an abbé, a priest. Well, as it turns out, even the bus stop over there has his name on it. I'll show you in a second so you can look it up. This priest was very brave. He fought bravely and was decorated after World War I, and during World War II he was an active member of the French resistance, and he was known for criticizing the Germans very harshly during his sermons here in Paris, where his church was. Eventually he was betrayed and sent to jail, and the Germans questioned him and they said, "Is it true what you've been saying about the Germans?" And he said, "Absolutely, and I wouldn't change a word," paraphrasing. So they sent him to jail, and then they sent him to concentration camps, but he survived and returned from the war, was liberated by the Americans in 1945. So this is a lovely square. You have a cafe when it's open here. There's also a hospital on the other side. And we're getting very close here to the outlying sections of the 13th arrondissement, very close to the beltway, the périphérique. This is the hospital, Hôpital des Peupliers. Again, the poplar trees are mentioned. It was built in 1908. It's private now, but originally it was a hospital that trained nurses. Right here. There's also a peak here at the church I showed you earlier, Sainte Anne of la Butte aux Cailles, the church that was erected in the second half of the 19th century when this neighborhood grew. So let me now show you what was done here in terms of real estate. It's very interesting. Here's an iconic Parisian view for you. The Wallace Fountain. You've seen them downtown in Paris, just about everywhere. You've heard their story, and if not, we'll mention it a little later on this stroll. But I love this spot here because we have the type of houses that were erected in the very early 20th century. And then past the Wallace Fountain, we also have all these red brick buildings. They're known as HBM, Habitation Bon Marché, and these were built right after World War I, when the last of the fortifications of Paris were taken down. They were known as the Thiers wall. Thiers was the name of the gentleman who had erected that wall. And so all around Paris and very close to the suburbs, close to the périphérique, the beltway, you still see a lot of these buildings. So interesting here to see the change in Paris in terms of architecture. Here's the square we just came from. Over there on the left, La Place Abbé Georges Enoch. And now I'm going to show you a couple more places. We are on Rue Dieu-la-Foi, or about to enter it. Right next to it is a plaque that tells us the building is part of a development of the HLM. That's a little different from what I mentioned previously. HLM, Habitation à loyer modéré. So here is the street Dieu-la-Foi, and here we see an example of what was done by private investment funds, private investors for workers who wanted to become property owners, but in a more maybe high scale or upscale way. So these clearly are a level above the ones we've seen that were a little bit more modest maybe, and in their mind this was really going to be a modern way of living when they built those, with gardens, beautiful homes, and in this street they even added garages. So this clearly wasn't probably for blue-collar workers, more for white-collar workers, or what we would call today executives, but still lovely. Beautiful facades, and the style here is very homogeneous. It's the same. See how the houses are pretty much the same here, so quite different from the ones we've seen previously. But imagine living here today in 2022. The metro is not that far away, buses are nearby. You are in a lively, culturally diverse arrondissement, which is the 13th arrondissement, and here you are living in a peaceful street like this one. You can park your car, there's a garage, and you have, bonjour madame, you have your own garden. So when we talk about happy views in Paris, we talk about happy views, we know what we mean. And the best part about living here is that you're really off the big crowds, off the path of the big crowds. Very few people would come here still. So it's a luxury of living in Paris and enjoying everything Paris has to offer, but at the same time at night retreating to your secluded little place. Bonjour madame. Ah, somebody likes la vie en couleur, life in color here. That might be mine. And outside every door, as you can see, you do have that marquise, that awning. So this was an example of more, I'd say more high-end type of housing that was done in the first half of the 20th century for people, for workers in general. Something interesting you can do also in this neighborhood as you go through the 13th arrondissement and also sections of the 5th is to spot those medallions on the ground that indicate where the old Bievre river runs underground. Here it tells you that this is where the former bed was, le bras vif. The Bievre had un bras vif, which was the active one, the one that went into the Seine river, and then des bras morts, which were really going nowhere. In this neighborhood, because we are right at the corner of Rue du Moulin des Prés, street of the windmill or watermill, and La Rue Henri Pape, there was a windmill here that was built in the 16th century and destroyed in the 19th century, and the water from the Bievre would make this mill run. So this would have been indeed a spot where the Bievre was running. And those medallions are all over the neighborhood, and you can find them. It's kind of fun to trace them back. And just for fun, another pretty facade. You see the ceramic accents above those windows. Those were typical of what was done during the Belle Époque at the turn of the 20th century, even in the Art Nouveau style actually. And these facades used them a lot. And then around the corner, we are on Rue Henri Pape, P-A-P-E. And right around the corner is a massive school complex, a public school. You see the French flag and the European flag above the door. But what's really pretty here is this tree, this row of trees, purple blooms, really pretty. I think I'll step under them to get back to the hill where we're headed. And before we go, one last peek. Here's another lovely street, the Rue Roussel. It feels a little bit like you're in England, doesn't it? All these pretty homes, different pastel colors. Like those two right around the corner, two different doors. They're splitting the building evenly. And here are the trees outside the school I was mentioning. And I thought it'd be very adequate to wrap up our stroll around the Butte aux Cailles and the 13th arrondissement, back at the top of the hill where we started from. We are along the Rue de la Butte aux Cailles. It's a very sleepy Rue de la Butte aux Cailles right now because it's not even 10 o'clock on a Saturday. All of those bars you spot on the left-hand side will be hopping tonight with locals. There is also one aspect we haven't discussed, and a hint could be the name of this restaurant. The restaurant called Le Temps des Cerises. Le Temps des Cerises, the time of cherries, named after an extremely popular song that knew its heyday during one of the most violent uprisings that Paris ever experienced in 1871, known as La Commune. And this restaurant, as you can see, is run as a co-op, a worker co-op. I had lunch there. The food is very simple. It's what we will call a cantine, a local canteen, like a cafeteria. Food's super simple, price is very affordable. But they have been here since the 1970s and they defend some ideals. The type of ideals that the people of Paris who fought during La Commune, during the spring of 1871, fought for as well. A notion of equality and solidarity, workers' rights. And I don't know that people realize how deep of an imprint La Commune has left in Paris with many people, and in particular in neighborhoods like La Butte aux Cailles or Montmartre or Belleville, where a lot of fighting happened during the Bloody Week in May of 1871. Fighting happened here at this very spot in La Butte aux Cailles, and until the last standoff of the people of Paris against government forces at the Cimetière du Père Lachaise, the Père Lachaise cemetery, which of course ended in a bloodbath. So it's very fitting, I think, to end this tour here outside Le Temps des Cerises with other references to La Commune. A little bit farther up is a square named Place de la Commune. Here is Le Merle moqueur with nice street art right on top of the gate here. Le merle moqueur, le merle is a blackbird, and le merle moqueur is actually a line from that song by Jean-Baptiste Clément, which was called Au Temps des Cerises. It wasn't written for the Commune, but it was adopted by the people during the Commune and later by the Communist Party. So Les Tanneurs, I had dinner there, it's very good, and actually more representative of what the neighborhood has become in many ways. But the old Commune ideals, the old rebels are still here, and you can hear conversations in bars, and it's an interesting crowd here. You get that feeling as well in Montmartre. Here's a crêperie, des crêpes et des cailles, crepes and quails. Now incidentally, Quails Hill, La Butte aux Cailles, has nothing to do with quails. The name came from a gentleman named Quails, Monsieur Quails, who in the 16th century was a property owner, a landowner here, who planted vines. And that's where the name came from. So I hope this stroll has given you a better idea of what La Butte aux Cailles is like. What we've done is we've gone from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill. We've kind of crisscrossed between two neighborhoods, really. We've discussed what happened to workers in this area, and why Napoleon III could never turn it into one of his model neighborhoods in Paris with the wide avenues and the tall buildings. He just couldn't, because the galleries and all the underground would not have allowed it. It's also pretty cool that we are stepping on a buried river, La Bievre. So lots of things to discover here if you come. Quite lively at night, as a heads up. Very different from today, but today it really feels this morning like a little village. I hope you've enjoyed following me through the Butte aux Cailles today. We went up the hill, down the hill, straddled a couple of neighborhoods of what was essentially a former village outside Paris back in the day, until 1860 or so. There are many more of these stories on the France with Vero YouTube channel. I have taken you to many more of these villages, and I hope you'll go there and catch up with them. If you'd like to support France with Vero and encourage me to do more of these virtual tours, I do have a virtual tip jar on PayPal, but the best way to support this small business of mine is really to join us on Patreon. We have a great community, a private Facebook group, lots of exclusive events, live events, much more content and stories to discover. So keep that in mind, and I will see you next time. À bientôt les amis.